Okay, let me change this to speaker view. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Trevor Ramos, author of How to Get Free Money for College. I have my colleague here, Trevor Mizrahi from Premier College Guidance. This webinar is about appeal letters, appeal forms, how to appeal, how to ask for more money from your college, and just a couple housekeeping rules. One, we are going to be recording this webinar. So if you don't want to be in the recording, please keep your camera off. If you have questions, you can submit it in the chat and we can address them there. If you want, you can take your mic. You can unmute yourself as well and ask. We're going to just go over just what we have prepared for you guys. And as always, you can chat. You can ask your question in the chat. Um, or we will open up for a second to go for questions. We expect this to be about 30 minutes and just leave you with some resources and some steps. All right, so that kind of sets the table there. This is how to appeal. So the first thing is, so when we talk about asking for more money, we're specifically talking about a financial aid appeal, which is usually suited either for a senior who has gotten into a school and wants to attend that school, and maybe the financial aid, they want to try to adjust the financial aid with reasoning. So they have a certain line of reasoning as to why they're requesting an increase in financial aid. It's also can be applicable for a current student. So if you have a kid that's already in college at a four-year college, you could use what we're talking about. This is the same process. And this is also is really for someone who's experienced a change in circumstance in the past 1 or 2 years. So right now, the colleges are using, if you have a senior or if you have a current student, they have used your 2019 income and that tax return. So maybe if your 2020 income is different, or your 2021 income is different, or if there was a transaction on your 2019 income tax return that isn't going to show up on your 2020, this is a good reason for you to submit an appeal. It's not the only reason. Any other changes in your finances, say like um, and so an example of that would be change in your employment, change in the amount that you're earning, as far as if you're receiving a different pay, different if you have a different job, or if the job cut back on income or pay. Um, if you're now in a situation where you have more than one child going to college, and that wasn't clear in the process. If you have a child going to another younger child going to a private high school or a private secondary school or elementary school, there's no room in the FAFSA to explain that. So this is where you would explain that in the appeal process. If you had a one-time occurrence, like I said, if you received a bonus or if you received um, some kind of severance, these things can shoot up your income at times. So you can write and explain that that was a one-time occurrence, or even the sale of a property. If you had medical expenses, that's another big one. If you've had unreimbursed medical or dental expenses, you can write the college and explain those, because there's no spot in the FAFSA for that. Just remind you guys, if we're recording this, so if you don't want to be in the recording, make sure you keep your camera off. And any other in-tax income. Say, for instance, if you had to report child support in your financial aid forms, but you're no longer receiving that, things like that. So any kind of situation that normally you wouldn't see on the FAFSA when you filled it out, you might be thinking like, when do they ask me for this? This is the process that we go over for you guys. Did I miss anything, Trevor? Any other situations?
I think you hit it on the head. I mean, understand like the whole thrust behind doing an appeal letter is really to have the school And the technical term, as you're writing your letters, is called a reevaluation. The people in the college financial aid office, even though they're really overworked right now, they're trying to meet deadlines, they're actually there to assist you. So don't be afraid to call them and explain things such as, and I have conversations with parents all the time. They say, and by the way, my name's Trevor also. So you might hear both of us referring to as Trevor. So let's say, for example, that in 2019, a family had taken money out of their retirement account because there was a hardship and there was just something that needed to get paid, and they took a withdrawal from a retirement account. Well, what that does is that increases your total income in what's called your base year. And your base year is what the colleges are most interested in when you're applying for financial aid. So if that's a circumstance, or maybe you had sold a stock, or maybe you had a property that was sold and there was a capital gain on your tax return, some anomaly happened during your base year that represents a different income scenario than what normally happens in your day-to-day operations. This is your opportunity to actually give the school an explanation and say, although you're seeing what my financial information is right now and you're basing my financial aid off of that, there is new and relevant information that we would like you to reevaluate. And the process, I'm going to give you some jargon of what they use inside the financial aid office, is called a professional judgment. And what that does is allows the financial aid committee to kind of get together, talk about what resources they have left over as the budget for the class of 2024. And they say, this is actually what we can offer to this family. Now, be very specific, because when a college talks about financial aid, understand that they think that loans are also financial aid. In their eyes, their vocabulary includes loans as part of their financial aid. What we're trying to do is maximize what's called gift aid, which comes in the form of a scholarship or a grant. So yeah, Trevor, I think you hit it on the head. Even though some schools are encouraging you to provide them with the most relevant information, if you don't have your 2020 taxes completed yet, what you can do is give them either a draft of what the numbers look like for 2020, or if you're self-employed, you could even provide them with a profit and loss statement from your tax professional. And these are some ways that the college can actually get you into the queue so that they can start reevaluating your financial status. One thing I'll mention, and this is something that I've come across for a couple of my families this year, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in particular, what they're doing is they're waiting for the first 6 months of 2021, and they want you to provide them with the first 6 months of earnings that you have for 2021 before they can actually render a decision on your special circumstance. So what I'm finding already is, because a lot of people in 2020 have had situations that change their whole income scenario, some colleges want to see, okay, is that still relevant now in 2021? And if so, we need to capture the first 6 months of your income. What I personally don't like about that is that you as a family are already committing to a college, sending in your enrollment deposit, doing all your housing, not really knowing what the outcome of that special circumstance is going to be, because they're waiting until June and you've already committed. But that's just the protocol for some schools this year. Other schools, and I've had success already with some private schools, they're a little bit more lenient, and they have the ability to work with you a little bit closer than some, let's say, larger public schools. So it kind of depends. But yeah, in general, Trevor, I mean, you hit all the high notes, so I think you're on track.
Yeah, perfect. And so while we're talking about this, so how long have you been doing appeal letters, Trevor?
So appeal letters since 2008. I mean, these are things that I personally would like students to have an understanding of when they do this with the parent, because I want students to understand how much their parents are investing into their education. And just understand it's a 50-50 shot. So sometimes colleges say, you know what, we're more than able to help you, and here's a couple $1,000s more. And some cases, the college just says that's really the most that we can do. But it's worth always applying for. It never hurts. And one of the questions I think I get a lot from parents is, well, is this going to negatively hurt financial aid that we're already getting. It doesn't affect that whatsoever. Understand though, and what I've noticed as kind of a tip would be, if you're overreaching for a certain amount, let's say that you're trying to increase your financial aid by another $25,000, that tends to be a little overreaching. So there is kind of a fine line that schools can operate in. If it's within a reasonable amount and you can show them that your budget actually does call for a little bit of an increase, whether it be $8,000, $10,000, $12,000, they usually find that that's a more realistic range where they're able and willing to help a family with. I just feel like if it's a too big of a number, sometimes they kind of just throw it out and they're not willing to even take you serious, because there is a fine line between what we call need and greed. So just be very careful with that.
Nice. Yeah, so Trevor's been doing it for 13 years. I've been doing it for 11 years. We do this every year. We do appeals every year. This is the first time we've kind of done a webinar together. The one thing I do want to make sure, just like I said, when we're talking about who this is for, if you've experienced at least a decrease of 10% in income since 2019, or an increase of at least 10% in expenses since 2019, or you've had a one-time occurrence happen in your family situation. So like it could be a divorce, it could be a separation. These are the reasons that are going to make for the most successful appeal. There is a situation where you can just write a letter for a school that gave you 20,000 in merit scholarships and see if you can get another 3 or 4 or 5,000 out of this. That's kind of a different process. That's really writing the admissions and trying to see if there's any scholarship that they've missed for the student, or that, any new information you can reveal about what the student has done academically. That's more of an admissions merit scholarship appeal. We're talking about appeals that you make to the financial aid office based on what you submitted in your FAFSA. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. And while we're talking about it, this is the era of COVID. So specifically, this is if COVID has impacted your life or business, or increased expenses, or interrupted your life, this appeals process existed before COVID, but they're even more interested in hearing the reasoning for COVID. In fact, I've already seen that some schools actually have a specific appeal process if it's COVID. So like I said, if you own a restaurant, or if you own a gym or something like that, and obviously COVID made an impact, schools do want to hear about that, and can adjust your financial aid forms in order to do that. We have to make sure that the school we're talking about has the money to adjust your financial aid forms. So what you might see is you could write the same appeal letter to every college that your kid has gotten accepted to if you've got a senior, and some are going to adjust the award more than others. And that could be a factor of just how much money they have. Okay, cool. So first of all, if you want to do an appeal, what do you need to do first? Well, the first thing that I tell you to do is go to the school's website in order to see what the process is. So here is, I just Googled. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so I actually just Googled UCLA financial aid appeal. I'll just show you USC financial. Okay, and it'll take me to this page. And this is their appeals and special circumstances page. And it'll show you how to appeal for them. There's a fast login that you go into in order to see all their stuff. But say, for instance, if there's a change in income or resources. So here they're going to give you the different types of change. So maybe there's a decrease in parent earnings. They want maybe a letter of reduction or termination, an income expense form you might have to fill out. They want to see your last pay stub. They want to see documentation of severance, copy of the most recent return. If extraordinary expenses, like I mentioned, so maybe elder care or out-of-pocket medical expenses or private elementary or secondary school tuition. And then they'll want specific documentation about that. But each school is kind of different. Some of them you can pull up their form right on the internet, and that's what I recommend that you do first. So let's look at UCLA, same thing. I looked up there, I just Googled the same thing, and it takes you to a similar page that discusses change in income, um, changes that affect the cost of your education, appealing for one-time consideration, stuff like that. And how did I get to this form? I think for UCLA, I just went to appeals. Let's see, do that right. I'm kind of trying to do it like a cooking show where I just show you the second stage, right? So this is the form that I got to. Um, there's definitely a link that gets to this form, but this is the form that you eventually get to. And here's a COVID support appeal form, and we've got a what's the other form they're using? I think it's the projected income petition. So let's look at the COVID support appeal form first. So it says if you have insufficient resources to cover your expenses due to COVID-19, you can request additional grant scholarship resources by submitting this form. And it just asks you to list out expenses. This one's a little bit of it goes over some of your cash flows, and it just lists out the reasons, based specifically off of COVID. Okay, and then they ask for a statement explaining that. We'll go into the statements, but that's the one for, and then they say, we encourage you to upload this document to the UCLA Resource Center. So each school has a different way that they want to receive these forms. Sometimes it's email, sometimes there's some kind of portal. If it's non-COVID related, like I said, this process existed long before COVID. This is the income petition and examples of eligible circumstances, changes in other income, like I said, child support, separation, divorce, death, and they give you, for the different reasons that you use, they give you different forms that you have to submit, as well as just detailing some of the monthly expenses and income, telling them how many people are in the family. And I believe that they also require some kind of narrative where you're explaining the situation as well. So really, as you can see with UCLA, they make it pretty easy to find their form. I know I didn't find it in front of you, but I found it before. So that's on their website. You can find the form on their website and you can fill it out, and it tells you exactly the process. Whereas with USC, you really have to contact the school in order to know where the form is and how to send it to them. But they do tell you things like, what reasoning they'll take. So you can review these pages for whatever school you're looking at, whether it's a school that you're considering or a school you're already sending your kid to, and look at what reasoning might apply to you. And, they always say at USC is if you're in doubt, just tell them anyway. Just explain to them anyway. They ultimately have professional judgment of what they can and can't take. So they may make an exception or they may make a decision given your reasoning that wouldn't be posted on this website. And I have one more form that I'm going to show you. I'm going to see if I can. Can you see this, Trevor?
Yep.
This is the Redlands form. You see it?
The Redlands form? No, we're still in the USC.
Let me switch to Redlands form. So I was just doing one. So just to show you, like, this is another school that makes it easy for you to find the form. And they go, okay, if it's a loss of employment, we need a letter explaining the circumstances. We need a last check stub, stuff like that. If it's a one-time payment, this is a big one. It's just a really annoying thing with the financial aid process. If you took money out of an IRA in 2019 and you didn't roll it over into another IRA, or even if you did, you're still going to have to explain that because it's going to increase your income by however much you took out. So you have to explain, okay, this was coming out of an IRA. This was a situation, then this is why I had to take it out. If it was a rollover or if it was to support my expenses. And then you have to show them your 2020 taxes to show that that's not something that you withdraw every year. It just happened in 2019, right? So that's, in separations, like I've done appeals where, the family wasn't divorced and they were happily married, but they lived in different states. So one lived in New York and one lived in California, and they both paid their own rent, obviously, at the two locations. So there was no way to explain that this family had double expenses, even though they were married. So we had to explain additional income or additional expenses. So, and then like I've had kids where they have diabetes or they have, they have some condition that leads to them having very high medical expenses, some of which are not reimbursed by insurance. So you can break down all those expenses, and the schools are definitely willing to look at that. And like I said, any other unusual circumstances. So this is kind of like that vague one. It just says students has other unusual circumstances not reflected in the FAFSA, which could really mean anything, right? So, and you fill out you fill out these forms, which basically you just get from your tax return, and you sign it, and you might have to attach a letter as well as these attachments, and you submit it. So that's pretty much that process there. Um, so let's so yeah, those are the forms. So we did a UC, we did USC, we did a University of Redlands, a private school. Some of the forms are easy to find. You just go onto the financial aid website or you Google the name of the school, financial aid appeals, and you can find the form right there. Some of them, the only way you're going to get a hold of it is you're going to have to call the financial aid office and ask them for what their appeal process is and what forms need to be forwarded to you. These forms usually take about 2 weeks to process. So that means that more than likely, they're not going to get back to you until after May 1st. So that's kind of a tough situation because, you know, well, I mean, based on how good your reasoning is, we can tell you whether or not they're going to buy it. Um, but you're not going to see an adjustment in your financial aid award before you have to pick the school, which is on May 1st, right? If you've got a senior, you got to pick a school by May 1st. You may not get your financial aid award adjusted by then, right? But based on your reasoning, we can tell you if it's going to be a reasoning that they'll accept, and you can almost kind of tell from these forms whether you fit in any of these or if you have unusual circumstance that requires professional judgment. So along with filling out these forms, because forms are probably something that they just really started doing about 6-7 years ago. It used to be that you would just have to write a letter. Am I right, Trevor?
Yeah, and then they started to look at providing them with more documentation, employment development, sort of like all these different documents to prove that you maybe had unemployment. And
Yeah.
yeah, so that kind of came recently. And then recently, I actually had a family who the parents are now paying for the grandparents to live in their home. So they're taking over like transportation, they're helping them go to the doctors, just providing meals and a place to stay. And even though they're not a dependent on their tax returns, for this purpose, it's an additional expense that couldn't be reflected on the financial aid form. So that's another reason why you could potentially, and when you were showing Trevor that other circumstances, which could be almost anything, that's usually where that falls in line is, look, you're taking care of another individual that even though they're not a dependent, that's irrelevant. It's something that the college definitely could know about and make an adjustment for you.
Yeah. So yeah, it could be a nephew, it could be a grandparent, it could be a nephew. Anybody else that you're supporting may not have showed on your tax return. This is time for you to show them about expenses that they haven't asked for. So even though these financial aid appeal processes usually have forms at this point that you just fill them out that we've shown you, a lot of them still require an explanation. Back in the day, there were no forms. You just had to write a letter explaining your situation. So I'm gonna have Trevor share his screen and just show a couple of sample letters, uh, that we've used over the years. He's used over the years, um, so you can get an idea of what the reasoning would look like or the narrative would look like.
Let's see. Do I have, so I could share my screen now?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Perfect. So this was similar to what Trevor was just talking about as far as having some outlines. This is Santa Clara University, and they also give, similar to what Trevor was mentioning, these are the required docs that you need to have and for the various different reasons. What I'm going to do is just show you a sample letter that I use to give families a heads up on like how to prepare this. And the reason why I wanted to go over this with everybody is to give you some specific qualifiers that you can use in this discussion. Understand that normally when a college goes through a reevaluation, if it's a public out-of-state school, let's say, like a Michigan or University of Washington or you name it, Colorado Boulder, the only way that they can really adjust things is if your family contribution, your expected family contribution, becomes low enough to qualify for what's called federal aid, which is also known as the Pell Grant. So we're going to send this letter out to everybody so you can have it just as a general template. But the reasons why I'm showing this to you is if you're, let's say, reevaluating this with a private school, then there are some things that can catch their attention. First thing I would do is lay out in the first paragraph is what your intention with this reevaluation letter is. And then second paragraph, you can go into more detail. What I have here is showing in 2020 the actual income for this family, and specifically what percentage of reduction was realized compared to 2019. And again, these financial aid professionals that work at the colleges, they speak a lot in percentages. So if they can understand that, hey, there's a 30% drop, 40% drop, there's things that we have to readjust as a family to just make ends meet. This is starting to paint the picture of what a financial hardship really is. In this case, she wasn't able to work as a swim instructor because of COVID. And then in this case also, there was the narrative that we had to reiterate to the school because this wasn't explainable in the FAFSA, which was the father was retiring now and no longer has the income that they had in the year prior. I use this language, and I do encourage you to use this language too, because if you include things like FAFSA forecaster, what that is a government tool to kind of project ahead what your expected family contribution would be if your income actually shifted. And so you could always run scenarios in the FAFSA forecaster to kind of get a heads up on what the government is going to, or the Department of Education is going to include in your overall picture as considering what your family contribution is. For those of you who are not familiar with what expected family contribution is, it's more or less an index that demonstrates your financial strength to a college to see more or less how much you can afford per year. You can also use language such as being eligible for the Pell Grant, or another grant that usually coincides with the Pell Grant called the SEOG grant, SEOG, Supplemental Education Opportunity Grant. And what you're doing is you're trying to see if they can reevaluate you more specifically for need-based grant money directly from the university. Because one of the first ways that a college is going to try to brush you off is saying, well, we'll just see if you're eligible for government aid, which is basically loans or Pell Grant. Nip that in the bud. Make sure that you articulate to them that this is your intention to see if you qualify for any university funding, institutional money. Also, what I find to be very effective in this case is if you can articulate to them the out-of-pocket cost that is left for the family to pay, what does that equate to in terms of your annual income? So I'll give you a perfect example. This family, University of Colorado Boulder, a school that depends a lot on out-of-state tuition revenue from out-of-state residents. Well, their net cost ended up being equal to 100% of their actual income in 2020. In this case, a family would either have to borrow the full amount or choose another school. So it's very important that you can point out to them, look, the remaining cost that we have to pay is equal to 60% of our actual income. So that, again, they're gaining perspective on how much of a hardship this is. Lastly, if you can provide them with your most up-to-date tax return so that they can accurately make a decision, I find that that's a little bit more helpful. And then there's this key word that's running around in our society today, which is called equality or being equitable. And I find that a lot of financial aid counselors are paying attention to making things equitable for every family. So, again, just some jargon that you can kind of throw in there. And then be sure to include your student's ID number so that they can go ahead and pull up the file right away and start putting the wheels into motion for you.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I'm sorry. Go ahead, Trevor.
no, that was everything I wanted to share with that.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. So we will figure out how to get that to you guys, or you can email us in order to.
I'll send that over to you, Trev, and then you could disseminate it to everyone.
Cool. Yeah, so I mean, basically what I got from that is, look, COVID, I'm a swim instructor. My income was cut in half. You guys are charging me almost what I earn annually. I don't know how you're going to do it, but can you figure out how to, look at whatever buckets of institutional money you got and see if you can help us out in order to make this fair. How is this fair that we're supposed to be paying this amount? That's just the financial aid. Now, financial aid officers, they go off of a specific line of reasoning. So even though for a lot of these forms, they have all these forms that you fill out, you will still need to have some kind of narrative, which you can kind of pull at the heartstrings a little bit and explain to them your situation. You don't want to go too far back in terms of, what happened in 2015, but you want to give them some kind of context as to what's going on in order for them to get a full picture. So, I figured this was just going to be a 30-minute webinar, but we'll stick around for a couple to take any questions or any specific, circumstances you guys might want to ask us about. So feel free to throw anything in the chat. But other than that, as far as what we got as the structure of the conversation, we're good. If you want to reach me, my email is trevor@collegefundingremedies.com. Phone number is 626-657-7887. And go ahead, Trevor.
And then you can always reach out to me if you want to. You could always just Google search Premier College Guidance, and we're here to help. We work with Trev too, so we just want to see everybody be successful. I know that this is a stressful process. Colleges have a whole team of people to navigate this, but we understand what colleges are looking for. So, make sure that you run things by us before you submit to the schools, just to make sure that you're not missing anything that's key.
Yeah. And, especially if you've picked the school already, you're going to send the kid there. You can appeal year round. It's just, if you're hoping that they're going to change your financial aid award before May 1st, that, you would have to get started on this process pretty much, right now in order to get a turnaround for them to adjust the award. So first question we got is, what if I wanted to appeal using my 2019 taxes, although I already filed my 2020 taxes? Well, they already have your 2019 taxes. So they based their financial aid award on your 2019 taxes. So then the question is there anything on, is the income on the 2020 taxes higher or lower? If it's higher, then you really don't want to send them your 2020 taxes. You're going to do that next year. If it's lower, you want to let them know that in 2020 or 2020 income is lower, so they can reevaluate you on that. Now, let's just say the income is exactly the same, but you might have had increased expenses in the past 18 months. And these could even be moving and relocation expenses. Any expenses that you could show them can also be considered. But yeah, I mean, they already have your 2019 income, and if you made more money in 2020 and you don't have any additional expenses, I would say this process isn't really for you, right? But if you made less in 2020 on your 2020 taxes than you did on your 2019, that's definitely an opportunity for you to explain that to the financial aid office.
One thing that comes to mind, Trev, now that that question popped up, and colleges will never, ever advertise this. They don't necessarily say, hey, we have a negotiation process. But let's say in this case, if you were offered some grant money and you know that your income is going to go up next year, what you may want to do and just have this conversation with financial aid and admissions is it possible for that grant money to be converted into a scholarship instead? And this is obviously before you're committing to the college and signing on the dotted line. Because what happens with a scholarship is that stays locked in for your child every year while they're in school, regardless of whether your income goes up or not. So it's something worth talking to the school about. I've seen it happen quite a bit where a school is able to convert an institutional grant to a scholarship, and none of that would be predicated on your income in years future. So it's kind of like a locked in grant, and you can act, or a locked in scholarship, but that you can basically talk to the school before you commit to them and enroll. So maybe in this case, for the person whose income is going to go up, that could be something where you can just discuss that with the school, see what they're willing to do.
That is a really good example. So say, for instance, your income was super low in 2019, but you know it'll never be that low again. You might have received a lot of money in financial aid this year, but you know you're not going to get offered that going forward because you already got a new job, et cetera, et cetera. So what he's talking about is asking them if they can just convert that offer, or how much of that money can they convert into just an academic scholarship, which is going to be offered every year as long as you are above their minimum GPA, which is usually pretty low. It's usually like a 2.5. As long as your kid has above a 2.5 or whatever the GPA term is, they're going to give you that scholarship every year. So you don't have to worry about, well, I got a lot of money freshman year, I got a lot of money this year, but the next 2-3 years is going to be full boat or whatever it's going to be. That's a good situation too. That would just be a question you would ask to the financial aid office. It wouldn't be really a full appeal. So now we got another one. Emailed my daughter's chosen college, Bard. Okay, Bard, nice. And asked if the amount they offered would be stable. Yeah, pretty much what we're talking about. They said yes. Do I run a risk of it going up if I emphasize that we lost income? Then they say that it went up this year. Then say that it went up this year. So they increase it next year. Okay, so I think I understood that, but basically, so you got a decent offer. You asked them if they're going to give that to you every year. They said yes, and now you're wondering if you run the risk of losing financial aid if you show them that your income went down in 2020, and then say it goes up in 2021. No, they're just going to potentially, depends on how much it went down, they're going to potentially give you more in 2020 because that's the year they're going to use for next year. I know that's what I just said was confusing. So they're going to give you more money next year because they're going off of 2020. If you want them to consider that you earn less money in 2020, then you go through the same appeal process that we're talking about. BARD is very cool about appeals. They're very understanding about situations. So if you made less in 2020, they're not going to take any, and then it goes back up in 2021. They're not going to take anything away from you. You're a good candidate for an appeal, depending on how much the income is decreased from 2019 to 2020. I think that answers the question. Cool. So yeah, any other questions, guys? Yeah, if you got questions on this, just go ahead and you got our Trevor. Can you did you put your contact information in there?
Let me put it in there.
Put at least your email in there. So that's how you get us. And me and Trevor, hopefully we could do a couple more of these on different topics for you guys. Some schools have scholarships and some grants. I know they are both free money that doesn't have to be paid back. But do grant amounts change? You want to take that, Trevor?
So that is actually a really good question. Grant amounts do change. They can change. They can still label it the same grant from the same resource, but let's say the index that we talked about, that family contribution, changes from one year to the next. That change in your income could augment the amount of the grant that the school is able to provide you with. If that were to happen, and this is a perfect example, let's say I had a student at a UC school where they just phased out of receiving the Cal Grant. So the income limit was about $105,000 for a family household size of 4 at the time. And they had earned like $107,000 adjusted gross income. So they literally just phased out. What the university did in this case was, because the Cal Grant was $12,000 and now they completely phased out of it, the university brought in their own institutional grant to essentially supplement what the amount of the Cal Grant was. Doesn't always happen that way, but yeah, I mean, if the school has the funds and they want to provide that same amount of financial need that they're giving you, then they'll find a resource for it. And this is only because this family's income was slightly above that income threshold.
Yeah, and I've seen schools give you the Cal Grant even though you were way above the income requirements. I've seen them do that as well. I've had a client we actually appealed to the Cal Grant, basically the California Student Aid Commission, to get the Cal Grant, and then the university just reduced their financial aid award by the amount of Cal Grant that they received. So at the end of the day, the university, this is why we're telling you to appeal directly to the financial aid office, because if you give them good enough reasoning, they'll figure it out for you. As long as the reasoning is solid, they'll figure it out for you. And we just want to make sure you know what arguments are good arguments and which ones are kind of flimsy arguments. Because you will have to provide a lot of documentation. So I mean, this will take an afternoon, but it could be worth to you another 10 grand a year, or another 10 grand at least the year that's coming up. So it's definitely worth it. We've had some pretty cool, successful appeals where people have gotten more money out of the process. But we really vet to make sure that the reasoning is good reasoning in order for us to, go through the whole process of getting you to appeal.
And believe it or not, this process, just to kind of give everybody a heads up of how much authority a university's financial aid department has to determine your end goal or your end amount, the financial aid office could literally go into your FAFSA without you knowing and make adjustments on their own and submit it to the FAFSA. So if ever you see a correction after you've already submitted a FAFSA and it says there was a FAFSA correction made, sometimes you could log in and it says correction made by school. That literally tells you that the school administrator had their own way of inputting information to the FAFSA to trigger whether it be a government grant, a state grant, a university grant. So the more that you can have these correspondence with the school, they have the authority to make those adjustments internally, which will also reflect on the FAFSA as well.
Yeah, with that, so we're at the 45-minute mark. I'll close out the webinar, guys. You know how to find us. And it's been a pleasure. Talk to you guys.
Thanks for putting this on, Trev. This is great.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you both.
You're welcome.